first of all, I'd like to say we come from the finest family there ever was. We had great mother and father, Grandma, who was a sweetheart. Uncle Joe was like a father to us, and Uncle Chris was a sweetheart too. I'm the youngest, best looking too, and I think we come from a great home. We knew the rules. We didn't follow them, but we knew them. I had many childhood dreams. My friend Vi and June Carlson were my closest friends, and Freddie Curvin. There was an old boat down by the river, and Vi and I were going to fix it up and sail around the world. And June said, "How will you get to ocean?" I said, "Just go in the water." And Vi said, "Is that all we have to do?" And I said, "Yeah." Not thinking of, there's many oceans. We spent hours down there. We weren't supposed to, because we weren't supposed to go down there without an adult. But I think that's why it was so much fun. And we used to play White Rabbit, and mainly on Dolly Curvin. Dolly, we were little buggers. We just had nothing but fun, and we'd get in fights. But we were always together, and we always went back together. When darling Fred was dying, he came to tell me. He didn't want somebody else to tell me. My sisters ruled me, but not too hard. I was spoiled, Collie, big time. My grandma, I was the baby. And I used to go to Grandma's, and we'd get the catalog. For hours, we'd sit and read this catalog, and all the things we were going to buy. And Uncle Joe came home one night. We had 2 pages full of what we were ordering. And Uncle Joe said, "Mom, you're not sending for that. She's mind your own business. This is Polly's and mine. Nothing to do with you." All the girls did a lot of handling me, because Mom was very busy. Dad was in the army, and she was alone. I knew nothing but love. And that's the honest to God's truth. Our mom was an angel, I think. And she taught us to be kind to others. And every Friday she would make bread, and we'd go up to the street corner and play White Rabbit. Well, I wasn't a very good runner, and Dolly Curvin came after us, and I could feel the broom going behind me, and I thought, "Oh my God, I'm dead." And Bert and Francine ran in front of Dolly to distract him from me, and I went and hid in the bush. We had chores to do, which I usually tried to duck out of. And Lena, Mom would say, "You go dust the floors." And I'd go in and say to Lena, "No, Lena, Mom said you had to." "Well, how come you always get away with it?" I said, "Because I'm the baby." I used that famous name for a long, long time. And so she'd do it. And then one day, she said to Mom, "Why do I always have to do it?" She said, "No, I told Polly to." Well, she told me you said her. So Lena was getting a little angry with me, and our voices got louder and louder. And I thought, shit, what have I done wrong here? She's not listening to me. And then Mom said, "That's enough." And I seen her coming with a plastic bat. I'll never forget, I ran out the front door, and Grandma Oakey lived next door, and she's, "Uh-oh, trouble in the Richards house." I jumped right over the fence. When each one of us got married, we were very fortunate to have Mom there. And to help us with all our kids. Mom was there all the time. I was 11 when Dad died. He was in the army until I was 4. So the girls knew him a little bit better than I did. And of course, the king of our family is George Richards. Betty only has a book and a half about him, but she's right on everything she's got. I don't have lots to say about the rest. Annie was a darling. Lena was a sweetheart. That's because I could dive or do some of my work. Betty was an ass, but a cute ass. And I got to tell you what Betty and I did with Lena one night. Lena was so modest. Have you ever seen her in her pants, bra and slip? That was naked. And I said to Betty, we just got the water installed, and each one went and had a bath. And I said to Betty, come on, let's go have fun. And we wrapped the towel, and we jumped in bed with Lena naked. Mom, help me! There's something wrong with these two. And Mom was ready to kill us. I mean, it was probably 10 o'clock at night. But each one had a special thing. And Bert was the big brown-eyed one, and everything had to be exact with her. And when she went to school, she was not late. Then there was Polly, who was late 45 times, and I lived on 9th, and the school was on 11th. So the teacher thought he had insulted me.
You lived on 11th.
I said that.
9th?
9th is the school, I said. And he said, I'm going to let you out 10 minutes earlier every day. You get here on time. Oh, yes, sir. And of course, he never did. And Freddie Kervin said, well, I don't know how you get away with that. And I said, because I'm more intelligent than you. And then there used to be these 3 boys who would beat me up. And George was coming home from school one day, and I went, George, help me. And he used to call me his little pygmy sister. He's, what the hell's wrong with you now? I said, they're going to beat me up. Who is? And I showed him. And he grabbed 2 of them, and he said, no, one at a time. And I beat the hell out of that kid, never stopped. And never had trouble with him again. But I got a little bit cocky, Colleen. And if I wanted the water fountain, I'd say, move. And this Michael Gleishman came to town, and he was there, and I said, move, it's my turn. He said, I'm not moving, I was standing here. And I thought, what in God's name am I going to do? Get this kid to move? I said, I'll meet you after school. Well, he beat me up. I fell madly in love with him. But it was full of fun most of the time. And of course, like any other kids, we didn't like the chores. But I'm going to let Betty go because
No, go ahead. You're doing fine.
She's got a good story to tell about her #1 brother.
I want to say a little bit of history about the family first.
Absolutely.
Because Grandpa came over, and I was talking to Auntie Dixie, the youngest one of the Van Hoopens, and she said it was 1910. And then there was in 1911 is when Grandma came over because he couldn't afford to get him right away. And he was told it was paved with gold in Canada. So he left a very good job in Holland to come to Canada. He thought he was going to get his family raised and, So he had to leave the 2 older ones, and they were 4 and 5 in Holland, and Auntie Lena and Uncle Pete. And then he brought Uncle Joe, and Uncle Chris came with Grandma. And when she got here, it was in 1911, and there was, she said at least 5-6 feet of snow, 30 below. She lived on 10th Street, where Garb's old house used to be close by there. And she used 47 buckets of water to clean that place because the mice poop was everywhere and there were stars you could see and she thought, why did I come to this country? So naturally she had Mum, who was born in 1912, and Mum was born at home, and then they moved down on 10th Street. That house is still there, and that's where Grandpa was only 42 when he died, so Uncle Joe took over and raised that family, and Uncle Chris then had gone to Vancouver, and Auntie Lena, but their promise was when he'd come back, and take over. Well, it never happened. At first it bothered my uncle, but then he thought, well, you know, he was an angel. There was no other word for it. And Grandma, they came every Sunday for supper, every Sunday. Now, my Grandma was an angel, but she didn't step in and watch us kids or come over. That usually was Auntie Dixie had to do those things. And then, naturally, my mom and dad got married, but I think the real little history in that is Milam's, you know where Sears Stores is. That's where Paul Milam lived, and that was a real good friend of my dad's, and my mom used to visit there, and that's where they met. And then Polly's named after him, Paul and Carrie, their name was, and that she's named after them. And so anyway, then they got married. Then my brother come into the picture, and I thought I'll just go through them all and say a little bit of history. George was born at Grandma's house, and like Polly said, Dad was in the service a lot. So Mom was on her own a lot, so Uncle Joe took over actually 2 families. And Grandma, during the war, I got to just say this before I finish that, Grandma lost, was it 42 relatives in the Second World War. A son and a wife, and going to have a baby, and 6 children, and lots of nieces and nephews. But the strange part was, she was lying in bed, and she said to Mom one day, you know, Johanna, Peter said goodbye. That was her son. She said, Mom, because then it was all teletype thing. You never got no, how could you say that? She said, he was at the foot of my bed and said goodbye. And Uncle Pete, that was her brother, who he was named after, when he wrote, I got that letter, edged in black. And it said, the same day that Grandma talked about. She said, I told you. He said goodbye to me. So then they worshipped. Then that was over. And it took Grandma a long time because she lost a little boy, Bertie, when he was 3. And so she had lots of struggles in her life, eh? And Mom was only 10 when her dad died. So think of Uncle Joe, a young man, taking over a family and raising it. And there wasn't welfare like people depend on now and all this stuff. But like my mom used to always say, she thought there was more sharing. If you had sugar, she'd give you butter or whatever. And we used to have Mrs. Broad across the street, and I could still remember them sharing. Mrs. Broad would bring Mom butter or vice versa. So it was probably a closer connection in a sense. Mm-hmm. And then when George was born, well, was that Grandma's? So up the street, no, Annie was born, you know where Marie Simons lives? Well, that used to be Jake Pinkerton's, that's on 9th. Annie was born there. And then Lena was born up the street on 11th, that we used to call the Lawler House, a 2-story. She was born there. And then Bert and I, the house that's still standing, I was the first one born in there on 11th Street. And Mom had me on her own, and the cord was around my neck, and she just took it off. Mm-hmm. And then Bertha was born there, and so Mom had a lot of struggles on her own, but Mom never talked about those things, you know, because she owned 3 lots, and then at the far end, we had chickens and 2, sometimes a cow, not a cow, a heifer, and we had ducks, and the sheep were called Betty and Bertha. And then when they killed them, we wouldn't eat them because we didn't know who we were eating. And we had, then the chicken coop, I can still remember, she cleaned it out and she rented it out to, forget those man's name. I
remember that.
Out on the Blayberry, because we had a man across the street that was a very good chiropractor. And so, you know, then when Georgie, so I kind of will talk a little bit each one along the way. And so when George was born, he was the apple of the eye because he was a boy, and Uncle, he felt like it was his child in a way because they did everything together. If Uncle Joe had to go away in the bush to work, Georgie stayed with Grandma because there was 5 girls at home. And then he just thought it was easier. And he worked very hard, our brother did. And one time oh, as years went on, because you can't have the whole story, but as years went on, he wanted to get Polly a doll. So in our house, there was only 3 bedrooms. So 3 of us girls slept in a double bed. George slept in the corner in a cot. Annie and Polly slept in the other bedroom, and then actually Mom and Dad had their bedroom.
Tell
And-
her why Annie slept in a
Yeah,
bed
just-
separate.
Annie had broke her hip when she was 12. And so Mom was always worried about the older ones kick her or something.
Yeah.
So she'd put Polly in there. And anyway, he wanted Polly to have a doll so bad. He worked for King's. And he wasn't very old. He worked his butt off at King's. And I think it was for Norman King. And I think it was potatoes. He dug and dug. He come home so tired. But he got her this doll about this high. And it could shut its eyes and open them. And Polly was in bed with Annie. And Polly says, the eyes. And Annie says, no, don't touch the eyes, honey. Pretty soon he went up. Eyes. And no, don't touch him. Annie fell asleep. Polly poked him in. He said, I'll never buy her another thing as long as I live. She wrecked that doll I worked so hard for. But the best dolls we had, Mom made them out of socks, men's socks. And she had 2 eyes, a button nose made out of wool, and a red mouth. And brother was, really young. And he loved that doll. And he left it out in the rain and the snow. And Mom, 3 o'clock in the morning, had to get out of bed because he wouldn't sleep because his baby was getting wet. She went out and got it and put it on the oven. He went to sleep. And then brother, as he grew up, he worked for he worked all his life, really. And he'd go hunting with Uncle Joe. But Uncle Joe was such a neat man that when he said no, he meant no. You knew exactly. He said he's going to kick you in the ass. He meant it. Because if you don't pay attention, you know what the result was. One time a teacher said to me, a couple, oh, that was terrible. I said, no, that's what should happen now. He was definite of what he said. He had a heart of gold, but he did not waver. And so Jack Thompson and George traveled together all the time. And they'd go hunting with him. And one time they shot over his head at a bird, He said, that's it. They were going on a big grizzly hunt. No, you're not going. And I can remember brother still standing there and saying, I don't care. He did because he wanted to go so bad. But when Uncle Joe said no, it was no. And he meant no. And but he went, and then brother, there was a plane that come in for forestry. And he worked on that plane, and the man's name was Don. And he'd pick him up there, he'd go circle our house. And then that meant for them to go pick him up at the front slough, which we call Reflection Lake now. And George would travel with them. And he did that, for a few years. And then they went to Parson, had a big epidemic of yellow jaundice. And my brother picked it up, and he was deathly ill. I can't tell you on there what he said, but anyways, Dr. Lapp said, if you don't have a repercussion, I'll eat my hat. I've never saw a case like it. He had sores all over his body, his eyes. It was horrible. You wouldn't have thought it was him. Mm-hmm. And my dad was quite medical, our dad, I should say, in the service, and he knew that he had to have a lot of attention. But anyway,
he couldn't even stand out of the bed.
He was so weak, and he said, I'll guarantee you will. So as time went on, he got better and he was feeling good. And then he was going to go to university. But I got to tell you about his horses first. See, right down on 11th Street, on 12th Street on the corner was the dairy. And so he'd go over there, and I think it was hers owned it then. And George loved it because they had animals, and they had Crosby first, I think, then hers. And anyway, he said he'd go over there, and one time he come home, he wasn't very old, and he was at the kitchen stove, and Mom was making this pudding, and he looked up, he had beautiful curly hair, and he said to Mom, do you know does a cow have to have a daddy? To have a little one, yeah? Because he's over on the farm. He said, so a big horse has to have a mummy horse has to have a daddy horse, yeah? So he said, so if a chicken same way, well, I know it's the kind of same way. He said, she's only, that's eggs are going to hatch. Then she looked, she said, you know what, sweetheart? You have to have a daddy and you have to have a mommy to have you. But that's good enough because you're pretty little. He said, okay, Mom. And that's all he wanted to know. If all of them had it, his little mind was curious. And he lived half his time there because he loved the animals. And he really liked this horse, and it was called Snorty. And Snorty was really a brand name riding horse. But he wanted to make it into a workhorse. Well, Snorty was going to show him that no way was he plowing a field. And Georgie had Gray with it. Well, Snorty would get on Gray's back, and poor Gray. And I always remember Mom hollered out, I'm going to tell you, George, if you don't quit it, you'll be buried in that ground if you don't quit it, because you cannot make that horse do it. It's a riding horse, not a, Lord and behold. Anyway, Snorty went out, but he'd come every morning 6 o'clock for a drink from George. At the back door, he'd start hollering for him to come. And so then he went from there, so to make it short, because he went to university, he did everything on his own. He washed dishes and done odd jobs and helped kids in school to get on. And he got a very bad infection in his hands because he was just in the water all the time and scrubbing all the time. And he got over that, and then he met his wife, Selma Jo. Then they had 2 boys, and then he was in the cusp all over. And then he was the president of Wellwood of Canada. And he did done really well there. And one time, I just have to tell you this, I think it was, I don't know if you call it Alcan or one of those big companies hired him because up north was really going broke. So they hired him, he went up there, and as soon as he went in the mail, he knew why they were going broke. They were sitting around. So he saw this one man sleeping, and he fired him. And he come back, and they fired George because he fired the owner's brother-in-law, and that was his wife's brother. So George said, fine, but you really don't want to know what the cause is. And so he left. So the Wellwood of Canada hired him as the head one. So anyway, that man tried to hire him back, and he said no, because you don't have guts enough to put business before other stuff. So then he got married, he had 2 sons, and they've done very well. They still live on the coast. And then my Annie, well, Annie, me, Lena, Polly, always lived in Golden. We've never left. Only George and Bertha left. And then Annie married Carl. And Joey came into the picture. Well, that was our dream, because Joey was everything to us. And then...
Tell her about Mom did.
What?
When he was born.
What?
Cigarette.
Oh, yeah.
Mom had never smoked. And when he was born, she asked for a cigarette. And I'll just call him, sorry, Mom, she looked like a chicken with a straw stuck up her ass. She was going, how do you do this?
Anyway, then I got, and we couldn't understand Annie because Annie, she was always, well, I'll have to ask Carl. Well, none of us were married. And I used to say, how ridiculous, Annie. We want to go to the show, we'll go to the show, No. Well, when I got married, Annie and I became very close because then we could understand each other more. And Carl was a good man, too. He was in the family for quite a while.
Please tell the story about when she had the baby, what the nurse said to you.
Oh, when Annie had the baby, Carl said, do you want to go to the movie tonight with me, Betty? Joey was born that day. And Ruth Ramstead, I don't know if you remember her. Anyway, she worked at the theater, and we went and seen Annie, and Mom was horrified. She says, Betty, that's their first child. I said, Carl told me to come, Mom. What's wrong with that? And they lived on the same lot. They bought land off of our mom. And anyway, we went to the show, and Ruth Ramstead said, you're a miracle woman. you had that baby this afternoon and you're here at the show. And Carl just gave me a poke to shut up because yeah, I'm a miracle woman. And because Annie and I looked a lot alike then, not so much in the later years, but at that time, everybody. But Annie never went anywhere. When she was first married, she went nowhere until I got married, and then we did Avon together, and she'd walk with Mark and so on. So we got out a lot more. And then come our Lena, which Lena had it really hard when she was young because she was very handicapped. And Lena would had her little left hand tucked in like this. And the man, I got to tell you, just wait, I'll finish about my Lena for this man that was renting at our house said to Mom, do you know Lena's handicapped on her left side? And Mom said, oh, I don't think so, but 6 kids alone, it's pretty hard to check on everything. Lena was the best natured kid in the world, Mom said. You could not beat her. But she tried, he says, okay, Johanna, tie her hand behind her back and ask her to take the cookie. And Lena wouldn't take it. And she says, no, try it again. No, she wouldn't take it. And then she seen that her little hand didn't come down proper. She'd always tuck it back up. So Lena was sent to Vancouver then, and the Children's Hospital, and the poor little honey nearly went nuts. And Auntie Lena that lived there was her namesake, and she did everything for her. So Auntie Dixie, the little sweetheart, that's Mom's youngest sister that still lives in California, she took her and brought her home. Lena was unbelievable horrible after that. She cried all the time, whined all the time, like Mom couldn't believe it was the same one. But the man across the street, he was a chiropractor, and he said to our dad, just the talent the man had, but he was an alcoholic. He looked one day and he saw the girls, Lena and Annie, coming down the street. He said, Annie has hurt her hip, cracked it or something. I might be able to help her, but Lena was born like that, and I can really help Lena. So my dad was very medical in the service, and he was very, very good on books. And he says, so I'll do the books and stuff for you if you take the girls for an exchange. And he said, sure. And I remember he had put a little ball in Lena's hand, and all he'd make her do was this and that. And he says, that hand will become this size too if you keep it going. And he would bring over to the house, and oh, we loved that, because Lena had to set the table, she had to take the dishes off the table, and she hated it, but that was to teach that hand. And you know, it's too bad she never kept it up, but you know, when we're young, it's just too much of an effort. But her left leg didn't drag. Annie was worse than Lena for a while, because Annie's hip was cracked, and when they didn't know it. And then Annie fell in Fred's Cafe, and Mom, once a month, Mom would go uptown and get her groceries, and one of us would go with her. And we'd go to, that was Fred's Cafe then, but it was Moon's before that. And Annie slipped on some water, and she crawled into the bathroom and held on the sink.
It was a banana peel.
No, water on the floor, because Fred didn't want to, whatever, she broke her hip. She got in the bathroom, and she was holding on. Mom thought, gee, she's a long time. She went there, and she says, what's wrong? And she was crying so hard. She says, my leg won't hold me. So she took her back to this McFarland, and he says, her hip's broken. And when she was sent out, this is kind of cute when it's a family, and she was, old Mrs. Hunt lived on the end of 10th. And Annie was on this stretcher, and then those days you went out in the boxcar. And Annie was on the railroad station, and Lena went up to her. Lena had heard Dad say to Mom, and he was crying because he was so worried about her, because you didn't have no really medical. Dr. Barkley was excellent, and he said she has to get out right away. So my dad was taking her into Calgary, and it was a real warm day, and Lena heard Dad say to Mom she could die because this is a pretty bad break. And Lena went up to Annie and said, I know, what's wrong with you, Annie? And Annie said, what? She's, you're going to die. And that's why, and Mrs. Hunt, she was crying her eyes out. And Mrs. Hunt comes, she says, what's wrong, honey? She says, I know why they're sending me away. And she says, why? She says, because I'm going to die. She says, honey, do you think they'd send you away if you're going to die? Why waste all that money going to Calgary? And Annie quit. And Dad tried to get her into the Children's Hospital in Calgary, couldn't. So he got her into the Catholic hospital, the Holy Cross. It was the best thing that happened to Annie. She had the nuns there. Annie was 12, 11. She was nearly there a year. And then she didn't want to come home because Miss Tennant, this nurse, took her over, gave her everything. When Annie got married, everything. And she just loved her to
She took
death.
Annie home when she did come home.
And then, so when she came home, my mom, I always remember this little story because Lena had so hard when she was young. She called her limping Lena, they did, and because she couldn't run, and she was lonely. So my mom said, one day you kids will learn just how Lena feels. And Annie was sitting, Mom used to always get us all ready for school, and then she'd work with Annie. And Annie cried, she says, but I'm so lost. She's a sweetheart. I'm not trying to be mean, but you remember when Mom told you about Lena? You know how she feels. Mm-hmm. She says, and that's a lesson we have to learn in life. But she used to have the coil lamp, and she would hop through the house with this bloody coil lamp. One time she fell with it. Lucky the house didn't burn down. And but Annie was a very caring person too, and she was the older one. So Annie always wanted to be the boss. When Mom went uptown once a month, Annie took over. You do this, you do that, you do this. Well, I was picked more for my brother because he was so disappointed when Polly was born. He wanted a boy. So anyway, we had, those old locks. And Georgie was bringing the wood in. And they were having this tiffle all the time because George was older. He wasn't going to be listening to Annie, I'll tell you. So they were looking through the hole. Annie was like this at him. And he put his fist and caught Annie. And but she really got it going. And so she was running over to Uncle Joe to Grandma's because she just lived, not even a block away, just on the other corner. And she said, Georgie, and he come over, and Uncle wasn't redhead for nothing, and Georgie went running to tell him I didn't really do it, and he just grabbed him, he just kicked him in the bum. He said, you get home, you start that again. Later he said, I feel bad, because Annie, you asked for it, because you thought you were being the big shot,
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just a family thing. And then like I say, when Joel come along, he was like a little prize in our family. Everybody, Granny Van Hoopen, who could never really buy for her kids what she wanted, she'd buy him new shoes all the time. All the time.
You'd go there and she'd say, hey, got a scrap, go buy a new pair.
And that's especially when she got her pension check, then she'd always get that new shoes for him or a new something.
New snowsuit or coat or hat.
And she then... Coming down to my Lena, then she got married to Ivan, and Lena was 12 pounds when she was born.
Wow.
12 pounds. Lena was the biggest one of the lot. I was the baby, 9.
Yeah, I hate to correct you, it was 13.
No, 12, Lena.
Anna told me 13.
Who?
Anna said it's
Well,
in the book.
Well, not in that, whatever.
Big.
What's a pound when you're 12? What's 13? And anyway, she said that...
This is
she
where
was,
Dad was scared that it'd help Mom, that baby would have died, they would have gone to jail.
Because he was helping her, he was home on leave. And Mom knew there was a problem. So I've got that little case of his. It's this big from the army, and everything was sterilized in it. She always had that by the bed sterilized. And so then when Lena, she got married, she was walking and she could do everything. But sweetheart couldn't read well because she had dyslexia, and like that's the sad part. Then it was you were stupid, you weren't really, but she had a memory that was phenomenal. You could take her to the city, she could tell you any point, any place. And actually who was Lena's godsend was Greg Meeker, the teacher that was here.
God.
Because he took her, he said, Lena, I want you to come to school. And she went to school and she could learn to read. You couldn't sign Lena's check after that because she knew it all. The honey knew it but just couldn't put it on paper. So then they were going to close that adult education thing, and he said, Lena, now you got to help me. We got to go to Cranbrook and talk. And so Lena said, okay. Lena, in lots of ways, was more wiser, or what word do you want to? No, more wiser, more. She was very, she was very wise, but she was more intuitive in lots of ways, and not more out. What word would I say, Colleen? Where she'd get up and say something out front quicker than I ever would. But I know at church I'd always read with her to help her to read. I felt very confident I had Lena, but I wouldn't do it alone. Lena would try it on her own. So anyway, Greg said to her, you know, Lena, you got to come to Cranbrook. So they went to Cranbrook, and he said there will be a panel of people that you have to talk to. Well, Lena thought, oh, okay, I can tell him that, you know. But she said when the place filled up, it was about 200, I nearly died. And I thought, I got something to tell him. She kept that program here.
Wow.
And she said, you see, Lena, by you being honest, you admitting what you had, if all of us would do that, then we'd have so much better life ourselves. And then, naturally, she was married to Ivan, and they were very active in the church. And they both loved that. And Ivan was a very good man, and I got to tell you one little blurb about our Ivan. He taught Mickey to put the water hose on for a drink. And then when Ivan was sick and I was helping him in the garden, and I saw Mickey holding this thing going, nom, 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 nom. I said, is he trying to get a drink? He says, no, he's drinking. And you know, Ivan could have a little dry sense of humor. And I thought, oh. So I held, nom, 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 nom. And he'd pick carrots out of the garden and take them to the side. Wouldn't eat the green part, just the carrot, and leave the other one over. He should have been on TV. So I thought Ivan was BSing me, and I said, Mickey, go get a drink. He went over, put the tap on. Nom, 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 nom. It was cute. Oh, it was cute.
And then sprayed Betty.
And he was he was a corgi, like the Queen had.
Yeah.
And actually went out to Roberts after they passed away. So that's kind of our story about our Lena, because Lena was a very, very pretty girl, but she had hair that was like a broom. It was like a bush. It was unbelievable. They all had very thick and curly hair, except me. I had about 3 strands of hair. And I have the most hair now out of them all, but at that time it was terrible. And my mom used to swear by cutting it, thickened it. And so a hairdresser said, well, if they can say what they want, because they don't know everything, she says, you sure got heavy hair now. And I don't lose my hair, even older, and so whatever happened, it was good. Mm-hmm. So when I was born, Bert and I were very close, because we were close in age. I'm not saying I wasn't younger. We wrestled unmerciful. One was Jersey Joe Walcott, and one was Joe Lewis.
She was Joe Lewis.
Joe Lewis. So I was Georgie's partner, so I had to be right on top of it, because if he cried, he'd say, I'll go on, I don't want you, you're baby. And so I remember one time at the table, Mom was making this stew, and the table was going up and down. Bert and I were wrestling underneath the table, and it was all set. And she says, when I finish this, she says, I'll slap you on the ass with that poker. And I, a corner of my eye, saw her put it over on the warming closet part, and I jumped off her berth, and I went in the bedroom, and Georgie said, oh, Betty, if you run away, and he started it, if you run away, I'll catch you. And I thought, yeah, and you started to hold on. He used to start lots of things and then go to Grandma's. And then Bert and I had to go get the coal and the wood in. Well, we had
to what she did.
30, 40 below all the time then, like 40 sometimes. One time I remember it so distinctly, and Golden was 50, and in Bladeberry was 62. I never forget that. It didn't last, but it was one time, it was such a... But you know, when I think of people now, even at 30 below, we went out all the time. We didn't have skidoo suits or any fancy. We put an extra dad socks on, extra. We still went uptown. And our granny did not go uptown to shop. We did the shopping for her. And anyway, Bert and I were going out to get the coal, and I said, put your tongue on the lock. I can still see it. It's about this high. She put it on, and she went in and she went to Mom, and I said, don't you tell Mom or I'll beat the heck out of you. And so, okay, Mom thought she tried it once, and well, you know, she's a kid. So we went up the next time, put your tongue in the lock. Bert went back in, and Mom said, I hate to say it, honey, but are you got something mentally wrong with you? Like, is there something wrong upstairs? And so my mom told Granny, and Granny used to say in Dutch, watch kelk je spel, and that was me. Watch her. So we went out for the cold next time, and we had this big, heavy door, and I said, put your tongue in the lock. And Mom said, Betty, I'll put your tongue in the lock if you ever do that again. So that was ended that. But you know, we did lots of things together. And I remember the first fellow I was going out with, and Bertha didn't, and she was an RN here. And then there's another one. She earned her own way to go to university, so there was no reason that the rest of us couldn't. They had the initiative. They had the goal power. Whatever you want to call it, because you can do anything if you mean it. And I still say to this day, you can do anything if you mean it. And they had the drive. And
But Betty had the nicest looking guy I've ever seen. And Mom had a back porch with a window there, and he'd be sitting at the kitchen table, she'd be sitting
and I'd be
here.
sitting there and I could see her.
And I pretend I was putting my hand through to grab him.
And you know, and he'd like, I think, oh God. And I knew every time I looked up, she was staring there. And, but anyway, I was lucky the one I got, really. And because I think I would have
I'll
had.
tell you, he sure aged lots when I seen him years later.
You wouldn't have thought it was him. You wouldn't have thought it was him. But anyway, Bert and I, we had lots of times together. But then when I got married, Annie and I became very close because I think the first married. And you could understand each other, you know. Yep. And I always think with my husband, he bought a new car, and they said that's why he wanted him. And I said, well, that's one thing, because we never owned a car. We never owned a vehicle. We never were allowed to hitchhike out to Parson, like a lot of people went. And you know what? I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful because I think it's caring that counts. Because there's always drinking if there's dances and da-da-da-da. And when you're young, you don't see
Carl
all of
Wilson
it.
used to take us to radium in the back of his truck. And we'd have to have a shower for sure because we were covered in dust when we got there.
But, you know, I think of all those things, and honestly, it was good. And then our life was very good. And Bertha, she was a very hard worker. Very, very hard worker. But I got to tell you, she was, when she went to college, she went to get her nurse's degree, was in Kamloops. And do you remember Scotty that worked at Barlow's store? Her daughter is Polly Caroline's the crippled one.
Carpenter?
Carpenter. Mm-hmm. Her mom. Listen to this, if this isn't something. My Bert, you could have been dying. She would not tell anybody at that hospital. That's none of your business. That's that family's business. And she was taught this by the head nurse. She's one time there was this, and it happened that the man got to know about they had a child with next door neighbor. What if that child died? Mm-hmm. Now, nothing's supposed to come out of there, and sad, but it does sometimes. So Bert would never say nothing. So Scotty said to me one time, I'm going to tell you, she said, my husband's so sick and he was in Kamloops, and this nurse comes every night. He used to say, my angel's coming. And she'd come in and she'd tuck him in and made sure he had something to drink. Bert was the kindest soul you could ever meet, but she'd never say it. She'd just go do it. And so one day, Scotty and I were talking in Barlow's, and she said, that was the nicest nurse I ever knew. And she said her name was Bertha Richards. I said, oh, she said she came to Golden to nurse. I said, that was my sister. She said, you know, Betty, he gave her a beautiful necklace. He died. And he said, I always want you to remember me because you were my right arm. Because Scotty couldn't be there. She had a family too, and she was always like that. Always did
determined.
Yes.
She had this one guy that was really dirty and he stunk terrible. And nurses said he won't let us bath. She went in and you have a choice. Either you come to the bathroom with me, or I'll put you in the wheelchair and I'll throw you in the bloody bathtub. And he never had any trouble. Bert was the only one who would get him to bath. And there's nothing they can do about it now. She's dead.
She was she was very soft. Like she was a good nurse, firm but a kind nurse. And she says, but always one little incident. She was what do you call the nurses that go out with Molly DeGracio? They go out to the country.
Yeah.
And, what do you call them?
What do you call them? Traveling nurse?
No. Well, the same idea.
It's that idea.
Yeah.
Though. Yeah.
And she went to this lady, she said, and I'll never forget, she had this little one and she had a baby, and she says, and she was telling her how bad she felt, and she said, and I thought, if you got up and got cleaning and get moving, you'd feel better. She said, I never said it, but I thought all these things. So then she had Eddie. Well, Eddie was going to show her what it meant to have a baby. Eddie cried 24/7. He had colic so bad. She says, I so bad wanted to go to that lady, because she didn't know, but I wanted to say to her, I'm sorry that I even had that thought, because, God, she cut the lawn with Eddie in her arm. She'd done the vacuum with Eddie in her arm. Ted had come home from the RSMP, and he would take Eddie and she'd make lunch. Oh, he was dynamite.
He was at the work one night, Colleen. He was so tired. He was on the typewriter and he fell sound asleep.
And then so they went out one night and they left him with Len and I. And he slept right till they come home. And Leonard says, I don't know what you're talking about. They had a soother. He called us at 1 o'clock in the morning. He says, I won't leave that soother. He says, only one I can find. And he come and got it, but he never cried once. A few times when we watched him, he was good. But I think it was because they were getting excited and nervous too. You know, that's hard when you have a little one cry steady.
Absolutely.
So then
Mom always
Ed,
could do good with the colic,
yeah.
not with him.
And anyway, they left. They decided they were going. He wanted always to be a lawyer. So Sweetheart decided, and when she had it in her mind, she'd do it. She had Eddie was one. Susie was born 1 year later, and then he was already in Saskatoon going to law school, and got to give them credit. He had to pick up some things out of grade 12. He had to finish his French, I think it was. He did it in 6 years. Because he said, you know why? Parents are so geared. It's parents that want the glory that the child went to university, not the child. I was so glad I never did because I wasn't mature enough. He knew that he had a family, and he used to always say, if it wasn't for Granny Richards, I wouldn't be here. Every summer we came back, there she'd have all of us in that house. We went back, and the car was filled with stuff. Every year, now he said, always talked about her being, who really put him through was Granny. It wasn't about money, it was about her love and all the stuff she put out for him.
The support.
And the support was there.
And
And
we got to tell you about Eddie. As he grew older, he loved the hose. And Mom was in the bathtub, and as the years went along, Mom couldn't move fast. So he put the damn hose and turned it on. Mom in the bathtub. I've never seen Mom jump out so fast.
ice cold water coming in. And but so then they got through, but they didn't expect to have the third one and the end of the year, end of the time, and it was Doug and Bert. She had the house filled to the rafters with boarders, and she nursed. She was just going 24/7. Mom went down to watch the kids because she was going to have Doug. And she stood at the top of the stairway and she said, I'm dying. And Ted rushed up and got her. And if God wasn't answering a prayer, he took her to the hospital, and that Japanese doctor, I think he was, said, that woman needs attention right away. They had flown this Japanese doctor and this other specialist for the baby in for another lady. Well, lucky when Bert got there, they were still there. Bert nearly died and Doug nearly died. And I've just got to tell this story because she was really having a struggle. And Doug, my mom said, I never saw a black baby. He was absolutely black.
Mom was horrified.
And the specialists come in and talk to her every couple hours. I keep a real close eye because she's really having a struggle. So Ted would come and she always said, they're in a coma, don't say something you don't want them to know, because you do hair distant. Be careful what you do. So Ted bought her this beautiful nightie. Every time from school he'd run over and he'd say, Mom, you just got to get better because the kids are waiting we need you, Mom, you know, talk to her. And so then this early morning she thought, oh, she didn't know what time it was. I'm going to put that nightie on. He's coming. And so she had it half on her head, legs wide open, everything in the world showing. And this doctor came in and he says, Mrs. Bracknell, what are you doing? She went, gotta go pee. And he said, oh, thank God she's coming around. And then she was good. And then Doug had to be monitored so close, because I didn't know 10 is a very important age. 2 is, but 10, he said, is such a big development in a child. So watch. And if he happened to say, nah, she'd say, honey, you don't know how to say no? Or, you know, this is how you say it, because she was so concerned, is there something wrong? Like Ted said, she'd make it wrong because she was so scared what was going to happen. But anyway, everything turned out well, and then little honey has passed away now, and Annie's passed away, and Myleena's passed away, and then just Polly and I and George left. And as far as myself, I've had an excellent life, and I had an excellent husband, 2 wonderful sons, and 2 wonderful girls who are just like my own, and 5 grandchildren. So what else could you ask for? And Polly, she's had an excellent life too. And sometimes I don't think, but she has. All of us have an excellent life. And everybody has to have their own pathway. Yep. And if we could learn to say, you hate to see them take certain paths, but if they learn a lesson out of it, is it so wrong? So if we learn the lesson of not to harp or not to keep at them, then we're learning too. Because otherwise, if they have to repeat it, it's not going to be asked to change them. They have to change themselves. That's right. And I just thinking that we're lucky that we grew up in Golden, and we used to play a lot of games like Run Sheep Run. Yeah, a lot of fun. Been let out. A lot of fun things, you know. So
I'll be back.
No, we'll be just a minute.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we won't be
you
long.
You don't have to go. And so I think that to sum it all up, we had a very good life. Now I was going to say about my dad's side of the family. There's only one relative. My brother has met them many times in England because he's gone over. But we only met Betty Prothero, and she's a short little woman, and she lives in New Zealand, and I keep in touch with her. I used to have maybe 25 pen pals when I was young. I wrote to everybody, and I got to tell you, the one in New Zealand was Bert put it. I didn't know this, and he put I love you, and you're the gateway to heaven. Da da da. I said to Mom, he's nuts. I'm never going to write him again. Years later, she told me she did that. He didn't do it. So I never wrote him again. But little Betty Prothero, she came from, she went to Toronto. She met her husband, Jeff. And she's, they call my dad Rupert, not George. I want to meet the family. And she came. And her and I have kept in touch all the time. And Eileen Winwood, which is another relative, I wrote for years and years in England. But I only met Betty. We did at home here, and she came several times to see us with her girls, and she's still alive. She's 95 in New Zealand. But when she went to New Zealand, the girls were maybe really young, and he died of leukemia. So Betty was on her own. But she came back to Canada many times. But that's the only relative that I can say. I wrote the other ones, and my mom used to write one, but really met was Betty. But my brother met them all. But our dad was a very soft man. Our dad was very advanced for that age, because he wasn't a strict type man. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, and I never remember having a licking from him. Never. I can remember one time I said, you like me better than Lena, because Lena had always asked for a nickel when he was mad. Well, I used to think that's pretty stupid. And then I said to him once, well, my mom used to say, he has a special spot for Betty because she knows how to cut him around. She knows what to do. And when I said that to him, he gave me a slap and he said, don't you ever say that again, because not one's better than the other. But Bertha was the one that looked the most like him. And Mom loved that dark color. Polly and Lena were totally jealous of her. Totally. Just how a family goes. But otherwise, everything was we had a really good life. There was no ifs or buts about it, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, honey, and I don't know what else you want to know.
I think you guys just did wonderful tonight. But I would, before you go, I'd like to ask you what your favorite thing about living in Golden is.
I think my favorite thing in Golden is how the relationship with other people and the closeness to me. And because with friends, I have the best of friends. I just feel like it's such a wonderful spot. We live in a beautiful country, and even when I travel, I come back home and think, my God, it's beautiful here. And I think it is the people, because you get to know them, and the more I get to know a little bit about their life, and you get to learn to understand them more, you get to be more caring and loving to each other, you know. And I think that too, that's what church brings out in me, is because we're taught that. Like, do unto others, you do unto yourself. What you want done, then you do it to others. And I think Golden has lots of that. I really do. Yeah, I think, and I lived here all my life, so. One time I wanted to move to Vernon after Leonard retired, but he wouldn't go back to Okanagan. That's where he was from. He loved Golden. He loved everything about Golden. And so that's where I stayed. Yeah.